Okay. Good evening. Are you guys ready to start the lessons in Leviticus? Wow, such enthusiasm. I want to thank Oliver and Chad and Steve for the opportunity. It makes me study, and that's good for me. I need to do it. If that's all I get out of it is a little deeper study myself, then it was definitely a benefit. Tonight I really wanted to just talk about some of the themes and some of the topics that we see in Leviticus, and hopefully hear from you what you think some of the themes and the topics are. Trevor, when he was here, he did that with Matthew 18, was it, or 17? Whichever chapter he did, he asked us what we thought was the theme of it and what we thought was going on. So I'm going to try to do the same tonight. So I'm telling you up front so you can think about it while I tell you some of the stuff that I saw were themes and some things that I wanted to talk about from Leviticus. I'm going to start with the last chapter of Exodus, the last thoughts we had in Exodus back there in chapter 40, and starting in let's start in verse 34. It says, "Then the cloud covered the tabernacle of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And Moses was not able to enter the tabernacle of meeting, because the cloud rested above it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle." Okay? So this is the very end of Exodus, and we get this image that Moses, the one who's able to come nearest to God of anybody that we've ever heard of so far, is unable to approach God in the tabernacle because the cloud's there. God's there. God's presence is there, right? It kind of sets up Leviticus. What I see is one of the main points of Leviticus is God tells us to be holy because he is holy. And I think he says that because he's trying to figure out a way to make people be able to approach him safely. And by that I mean we see what happens when people don't approach him safely in Leviticus. And we'll talk about that in one of the lessons we do. When two of Aaron's sons lit strange fire or burnt strange incense to God, and then they were killed. So it's one of the themes I see in Leviticus is that the closer we get to God, the more we have to prepare for that closeness. The high priest has extra things that they have to do to become pure as possible, to come in the presence of a pure God, right? So there's talk in Leviticus about impurity and purity, and there's a lot of offerings and things, different things that make it so we can approach God. And the closer we get to God, the high priest being closest to God when he goes into the Holy of Holies once a year on the Day of Atonement, right? He has to do a bunch of extra stuff just to do that one day, to be in God's presence, direct presence, just for a little bit of one day, right? And we need to do different things to make ourselves pure, as close to holy as we can be. And I think that's kind of what we're getting in Leviticus. Leviticus starts with the word, mine in New King James says now, and I saw some versions that had and, but now or and, whichever one it is in your version, that connects it to Exodus, to this last thought that Moses couldn't come into the tabernacle because the presence of the Lord was there. Some of the commentation, and maybe even what I'm going to present in this, I don't know if you guys know Bible Project, but I was going to play the Bible Project 8-minute summary of Leviticus because I really enjoyed that. It helped me a lot when I was studying it to get some other thoughts going about what's going on in Leviticus. And one of the thoughts that's presented is that God is like the sun, which is really beautiful and helpful to us. Like the sun gives us light and heat and a lot of it makes things grow, all that stuff, right? But if we got too close to the sun, what would happen to us? As you approach it in a rocket ship, you would burn up, right? And it's kind of the same, it's an analogy of God. The closer you get to God, if you're not prepared for that, it could be dangerous. You could die. And we get that in Leviticus. People who were trying to become into the presence of God and didn't do it the way God told them to do it, they didn't live through it, right? So God's so pure that we have to approach purity as we approach him, I guess is kind of the thought that I'm trying to get at. The real interesting thing about the first verse of Leviticus 1:1 is that it says now, so it connects it to Leviticus or to Exodus, but it says now the Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tabernacle of meetings. So Moses still can't go in there. He's not speaking to him in the tabernacle of meetings. He's speaking to him from it, right? So this whole problem of being able to approach him seems to be the beginning thought of Leviticus. What can we do to approach God? And God gives us the answer, right? The next thing he says is, the Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tabernacle of meeting, saying, speak to the children of Israel. Okay, so give you a preview of this book. That idea that God calling to Moses, God speaking to Moses and telling him to tell the children of Israel, that's repeated a lot of times in here, at least 40 times in this book. That God is speaking to Moses, sometimes Moses and Aaron, a few times. One I think once it's even just to Aaron as the high priest. But God's speaking to Moses, and he's saying, this is what I want you to tell the Israelites, right? This is what I want the Israelites to know. So that's one of the thoughts that I came across about Leviticus that I was trying to convey to Randy earlier in the week, that I feel like Leviticus is written for everybody, and it keeps the priests honest, in the sense that an everyday person could read this, teach his son this, and knows that this is what I'm supposed to do for these burnt offerings, whatever I'm supposed to do when I approach God. When I go to the tabernacle and I bring my unblemished first-year-old goat or lamb for a whole burnt offering, I know what's going to happen with the priest, what the priest is going to do with it. After I hold its head and we cut its throat, I know what's going to happen. I know where the blood's going to be sprinkled. I know what the priest is going to do next. I know what he's going to do with the stuff that we're not going to burn, and what part we're going to burn, what part's going to be a memorial to the priest that they can eat, all that stuff, right? It's written to the children of Israel, to everybody. So because it made me think of that whole, there's a time in history when the Catholic Church, the priests kind of lorded over the common folk, because they were the only ones who could read Latin, right? They're the only ones who could read the Word of God, right? So they had this weird power, this strange control over the worship of God, the service of God, right? And the common folk, whatever they said, we have to buy, right? I can't read it, right? But Leviticus looks like it's written specifically to avoid that. That's not going to happen with this writing, because Moses is told exactly what God wants, and he's told to tell the Israelites what I'm telling you, right? Over and over and over again in this book. It's not to be kept as a secret or as a priestly caste thing, like only they know, right? It's common knowledge to everybody. So this book, the more I look into it, the more I'm fascinated by this book. And when Oliver asked me to study it, my first thought was what it's always been like. I don't like this book. It's too bloody. It's too complicated. Like there's too many rules and what's going on. But the more I read it, the more I realize that it's simply God trying to solve this problem that He knows exists. That we're impure, and He's pure, and like oil and water, that just doesn't mix. And the only way that we can approach Him is to work on being more pure. And that's why all the rules about the food and the purity laws are in here. Right? And it's not in the sense that, like, when somebody touches a dead body, they're impure to the point where that's a sin. It's not a sin to be ritually impure. But it would be a sin if you brought that impurity to the presence of the pure being that created you. That's the problem, is we have to deal with the fact that the impurity can't mix with the purity, right? So I'm fascinated by this book. So let me play this thing for you, because I think it helped me kind of organize some thoughts about Leviticus, and I think it's about time that that I share it with you guys.
The book of Leviticus. It's the third book of the Bible, and it's set right after the exodus of the Israelites from their slavery, when God brought them to the foot of Mount Sinai and invited Israel into a covenant relationship. Now, they had quickly rebelled and broke that covenant, and God had wanted for His glorious presence to come and live right in the midst of Israel in the form of this tabernacle. But Israel's sin has damaged the relationship. So, at the end of the previous book, Exodus, Moses, as Israel's representative, could not even enter God's presence in the tent. The book of Leviticus opens by reminding us of this fundamental problem. It says, "The Lord called to Moses from the tent." So the question is, how can Israel, in their sin and selfishness, be reconciled to this holy God? That's what this book is all about, how God is graciously providing a way for sinful, corrupt people to live in His holy presence. Now, let's pause for a second and explore this really important idea that God is holy. It's fundamental to understanding this book. The word holy means simply to be set apart or unique. And in the Bible, God is set apart from all other things because of His unique role as the creator of all, as the author of life itself. And so if God is holy, then the space around God is also holy. It's full of His goodness and His life and purity and justice. So if Israel, who is unjust and sinful, wants to live in God's holy presence, they too need to become holy. Their sin has to be dealt with. Thus, the book of Leviticus. Now, the book has a really amazing symmetrical design. It explores the three main ways that God helps Israel to live in His presence. The outer sections are descriptions of the rituals Israel was to practice in God's holy presence. The next inner sections focus on the role of Israel's priests as mediators between God and Israel. And inside of that are two matching sections that focus on Israel's purity. And then right here at the center of the book, there's a key ritual, the Day of Atonement, that brings the whole book together. The book concludes with a short section where Moses calls on Israel to be faithful to this covenant. Let's dive into the book. The first section explores the 5 main types of ritual sacrifices that Israel was to perform. 2 of these were ways that an Israelite could say thank you to God by offering back to God these symbolic tokens of what God has first given them. 3 other sacrifices were different ways of saying sorry to God. So here an Israelite would offer up the lifeblood of an animal while confessing that their sin has created more evil and death in God's good world. But instead of destroying this person, God, of course, wants to forgive them. And so this animal symbolically dies in their place and atones, which means it covers for their sin. And so through these rituals, the Israelites were constantly being reminded of God's grace grace, but also of his justice and of the seriousness of their evil and its consequences. The second set of rituals lays out the 7 annual feasts of Israel, and each of these retold a different part of the story about how God redeemed them from slavery in Egypt and brought them through the wilderness on their way to the Promised Land. And by celebrating these feasts regularly, Israel would remember who they were and who God was to them. Now, the sections about Israel's priests, you have Aaron and his sons first ordained to enter into God's presence on behalf of Israel. And then in this matching section, we find the qualifications for being a priest. The priests were called to the highest level of moral integrity and ritual holiness because they represented the people before God, but then also represented God to the people. Now, we find out why the priest's holiness matters so much back here in this first section. Right after the family of Aaron was ordained, 2 of his sons waltz right into God's presence and flagrantly violate the rules. And so they are consumed by God's holiness on the spot. It's a haunting reminder of the paradox of living in God's holy presence, because it's pure goodness, but it becomes dangerous to those who rebel and insult God's holiness. And so it's important that Israel's priests become holy, and also that all of the people of Israel become holy, which is what the next intersections are all about. Chapters 11 through 15 are about the ritual purity required of all the Israelites, and chapters 18 through 20 are about the moral purity of the people. Here's what's underneath all of this purity and impurity language. Because God is holy and he's set apart, the Israelites need to be in a state of holiness themselves when they enter into his presence. This was called being clean or pure. God's presence was off limits to anybody who was not in a holy state, and this was called being unclean or impure. Now, an Israelite could become impure in just a few ways: by contact with reproductive body fluids, by having a skin disease, by touching mold or fungus, or by touching a dead body. Now, for the Israelites, all of these were associated with mortality, with the loss of life, which gets us to the core symbol of all these ideas. You become impure when you're contaminated by touching death, so to speak. And death is the opposite of God's holiness, because God's essence is life. Now, this is really key. Simply being impure was not sinful or wrong. Touching these kinds of things was a normal part of everyday life. And impurity was a temporary state. It just lasted a week or two, and then it's over. What was wrong or sinful was to waltz into God's presence carrying these symbols of death and impurity on my body. Don't do that. Now, the last way of becoming impure was by eating certain animals, and the kosher food laws are found right here in this section. Now, there have been lots of theories about why certain animals were considered impure and off limits. To promote hygiene or to avoid cultural taboos, the text just isn't explicit. But the basic point of all of these chapters is really clear. Altogether, these work as an elaborate set of cultural symbols that reminds Israel that God's holiness was to affect all areas of their lives. This corresponding section over here is about Israel's moral purity. The Israelites were called to live differently than the Canaanites. They were to care for the poor instead of overlooking them. They were to have a high level of sexual integrity, and they were to promote justice throughout their entire land. Now, here at the center of the book, we find a long description of one of Israel's annual feasts, the Day of Atonement. Odds are that not every Israelite's sin and rebellion would be covered through the individual sacrifices, and so once a year, the high priest would take 2 goats. One of these would become a purification offering and atone for the sins of the people, and the other was called the scapegoat. The priest would confess the sins of Israel and symbolically place them on this goat, and then it would be cast out into the wilderness. Again, this is a very powerful image of God's desire to remove sin and its consequences from his people so that God can live with them in peace. The book concludes with Moses calling Israel to be faithful to all of the terms of the covenant, and he describes the blessings of peace and abundance that will result if Israel obeys all of these laws. He also warns them that if they're unfaithful and dishonor God's holiness, it will result in disaster and ultimately exile from the land promised to Abraham. Now, if you want to see how Leviticus fits into the big storyline, it's helpful to look at the first sentence of the next book of the Bible, Numbers. It begins, "The Lord spoke to Moses in the tent." So we can see that Moses is now able to enter God's presence on behalf of Israel. The book of Leviticus, it worked. So despite Israel's failure, God has provided a way for their sin to be covered so that God can live with sinful people in peace. And that's what the book of Leviticus is all about.
Okay. What do you think of that? It's pretty good for 8 minutes, right? You get a lot of good information. And they're pretty spot on most of the thoughts. I lose them a little bit when they start trying to explain why the food laws are in there. I don't like going down that kind of a road because it's all supposition, right? God put them in there. He said which ones were pure. He said which ones were impure. And that's it, right? The clean animals and the unclean animals, that's it. I don't want to question why. But the rest of it, pretty good, huh? Does it spark any thoughts about what you think Leviticus is about? Or what you think a major theme in Leviticus is? It did for me. It brought me back to blood. When you talk about those two middle chapters about the Day of Atonement, the 16 is about the Day of Atonement and what happens, what the high priest is supposed to do. But 17 is more about blood, and a couple other times in Leviticus we talk about the importance of blood and the life that is in blood. And it's a symbol, the life that blood is it's such a strong symbol that God forbids them from eating blood. Right? It's like a protected symbol, but they're sprinkling blood all over the place. They're doing daily sacrifices multiple times a day. They're doing sacrifices, and this blood they're covering it over on the dirt. Some of it they're sprinkling it on the horn of the altar. They're sprinkling it all over the tabernacle, and on different things. They're sprinkling on the people. They're sprinkling on the priests. They're rubbing it on their ears and their toes. It's, there's blood everywhere, right?
Well, symbolically, that's a cleansing.
Mm-hmm. That's right. It's the atonement. That's the theme. What do you guys say atonement means? What's atonement mean? They said it was covering over or covering up, which is, when I look at the Hebrew for atonement, that's pretty much what it is. It's a covering over.
What's the difference between the effect of God's law in the Old Testament and the effect of God's law through Jesus Christ?
Excellent. So that's one of the themes that popped out from after I watched this. I immediately recognized how Leviticus is pointing to Jesus like nothing else in the Bible, nothing else in the Old Testament. Leviticus is all about Jesus. He's the atonement. He's every one of those sacrifices. He's the whole sacrifice. He's the peace offering. He's the grain offering. He calls himself the bread of life. Wow.
Wait until now we haven't been able to see the cost of sin. Now we see
That's right. Very good. Yes. The cost of sin. It's very costly, isn't it? I mean, if you think about it, it took the blood of God, Jesus' blood, to actually pay the price, right? To pay the ransom, as it were, to redeem us. That's what redemption is all about, isn't it? It's we get a little bit more about that with with Esther and Boaz. I mean, not Esther, but Ruth and Boaz, redeeming a male person in your family could redeem you, and that's talked about in Leviticus. That's talked about in Leviticus. So yeah, those are all great themes. So a little bit of a preview from that. They talked about the feast days, and hopefully I've asked Ken and Connor to do half of a class each that, on those. They said 7, but 2 chapters later, in chapter 25, there's a section about the Sabbath year, which is every 7 years, and when we're supposed to fallow the ground, rest the ground, and then the Jubilee, which is every 50 years. 7 times 7, 7 Sabbath years, 7 the next year, 50 years. And the Jubilee would be the moment where everybody was automatically redeemed. You didn't have to ransom somebody. They would just be released from whatever service they were doing to you, right? And I'm going to let them. So Ken's going to do the first 5, and Connor's going to do the last 4. Let them talk about it however they like. Yeah, that's one of the classes we're going to do during this section. I've already started kind of coming up with the first couple ideas next week and the week after, and I'll just tell you that it's a good idea to read through Leviticus, all of it, but definitely the first 7 chapters for next week. What do you guys want to study in Leviticus? Is there anything that you want me to, because what I'm saying is I have a couple of them, and I've already committed to a couple of them, to 3, but the rest of the year, besides the one that Kent and Connor are doing, they're kind of still up for grabs. I'm still kind of working on them, and I'm hoping that I cover something that people want to look into deeper in Leviticus. Yeah.
About the theme of obedience, the importance of obeying God strictly when He commands us to do something is evident by Leviticus 10.
Yeah, I kind of was leaning towards that, but the way that Oliver kind of put it was, doing it God's way, not my way, right? So the obedience is not just following God, but it's accepting it that the God has put it to this way, and I need to do it exactly that way. If I do it outside of that way, that's disobedient. If I add any part of my own thought to it and do it my way, that in essence is disobedience, right?
As sincere as you are in doing it.
Yes, exactly. Even with all the best intentions. I don't want to challenge Nabat and Abihu's intentions, but they did it in a different way than what God commanded, and that's exactly how it reads. They presented this fire that was foreign or strange, and it wasn't the exact way that God told them to make it, somehow, right? He gives us clear indication in this book and in Exodus. Most of this stuff you can find in Exodus as well, by the way.
Well, it wasn't an issue of ignorance any more than it's an issue of ignorance today when we sin. It's willful choice.
That's right. Presumption, willfulness. Yeah, so I was thinking about doing one of the classes kind of on that topic. And yeah, that one's one of the trickier ones. Any other themes or topics that you see popping out at you in Leviticus that you want me to go deeper into, or you want to go deeper into? I really want to do one all about how it ties to Jesus. Yes, Steve?
I always looked at the book of Leviticus, Leviticus, which really stands for the priestly tribe, Levi, and the instructions to them. And my thoughts really go along with Randy's. And you think of all of these intricate details that they were given to follow, God expected them to follow. And I really think it gives us a view of God and what He expects of us.
Of His people.
And to think, it's hard for me to imagine, okay, they had to get it all straight. But I suppose through repetitiveness that they would have it pretty straight. I mean, this was something they did time and time and time again.
Yeah, every day.
And,
Definitely would be repeated and repeated and repeated.
rules.
Follow the pattern.
Follow a pattern over and over and over and over again. That pattern is to be repeated, right? One of the interesting things that I found out and going deeper is Leviticus didn't become the name of this book until the Latin Vulgate version of the Bible, that the Hebrews basically called it God called, which is those first couple of words that we see, and we see throughout, like I said, 40 times, God called to Moses or God spoke to Moses. It's this idea that, in my mind, I feel like it's tied to the idea of being called out. That holiness, separate, is talked about in the New Testament as us. We're His holy nation, is a nation of priests, right? That are called out, that are separate, holy from the world, right? And I feel like that's almost a better name for it, because like I said, I don't think it's written just to the Levites. I think it's specifically written to all the Israelites so that we keep almost like a check and balance in my mind. Like you can't, the priests don't get too much power over me. They can't say, oh, I'm going to keep all this part of your lamb, and because I know you're only supposed to keep that memorial part, right? And I know what you're supposed to do with the rest of it, right? Keeps us all on the same page. Keeps us all honest. They're very good, yeah. Something that's often missed when you talk about a priest caste. Like other religions, there is kind of a power dynamic to the priest. I have to go to them. This is my only way, right? And I think that's the whole idea in Leviticus, is that it's pointing to the ultimate mediator, the ultimate high priest, which is Jesus, not only representing us to God, but representing God to us, right? Really powerful stuff, right? I mean, deep. Leviticus means as pertaining to the Levites, by the way. That's what it's Latin for. But I think that was a man-made title that came much later than what the original people that read it considered it by a different name, I guess, is what I'm trying to get at. Yeah.
That'd be interesting too, if you, while you're studying this, extrapolate kind of what all of this equals over a year or over a month, or how many animals are you talking about, how much blood, how does this all, how does this, because I think in our minds it's pretty, we read it's pretty cut and dry, you do this, but there's a lot of other stuff that goes along with it, maybe not in the details. It seems like I don't want to see it on video or anything like that, but I'm thinking having more of a better context.
It's gory. Yeah, I don't want to see it either. I think sometimes I think of it like that. Like that would have been hard to watch all the time. To be a priest just serving that a day or two in a row, you'd probably be pretty bloody. Like all your clothes, all your,
But all the sacrifices were made by the person that was making the sacrifice, not the priest.
That's right. Well, but the priest was involved with the killing, with the sprinkling of the blood, with the burning it. The priest is the one who burns it on the altar. So yes, the person themselves is going to get bloody, the one who's bringing the sacrifice. But so is the priest, and the priest is doing it over and over and over. You think about it. I mean, if there's a line of people coming in to do a sacrifice, I got to do all of them, right?
As far as we know, there's like one altar, right? There is one altar.
It's like tea times. You have to schedule when you're up. 8 a.m. altar time for me and 9 a.m. for you. I don't know.
You wonder if they would get numb to it, though. I mean, because there's things that you see in the news, that just you see it over and over again, that you would just.
don't think they would consider it like gory like we do, but they're also probably killing their own animals for food, doing their own slaughtering, for food, dressing. When I watch someone do a field dressing now, I'm like, what is that? I don't know. I've never done it. Some people who have done it, they probably have a better understanding of what's going on here, But it's, I'm pretty far removed from. In my mind, it's hard to imagine for me. I don't know if it is for you, but it's hard for me to imagine how it would have been, I mean, sometimes I think about it, I'm like, how could you even cover up all that blood? There's so much blood. How could you cover that over with the dirt, just from the initial, when my hands are on it and we slit its throat and it drains out. That's a lot of blood, right? I mean, I don't know. It's sometimes it's hard to imagine,
One thing is, this just part of you breathe the skin and what was taken outside the camp and burned. And,
The offal, yeah,
That. The other thing is, and they talked about on the little clip that you showed about how a lot of this is showing people how they're going to be separate from the world around them. Because
different from the Canaanites, right?
and at this time, they're still all together in a camp where they're all there. These rules have to change when they get into the land, and they can't bring, because it says if you offer something in the field, you have to bring it in to the priest. You can't just leave it out in the field. So, I mean, that has to change when they're spread out through the whole land of Canaan. And you see, them doing offerings.
Yeah, they do the ransom thing at that point where they have to bring something in place of it to do it separate from.
So these rules, I think, are, like I said, are set in place here to show the Israelites, okay, you're a separate people now, you're a special people, you're called out. But that again, they evolve into something different, whether it's the feast days where they come.
Right.
It's not every day where they're coming to the tabernacle, because, I mean, it's one of the days you're away for a while. I don't know how that worked. I don't know enough about the offerings. All that worked, but
Yeah, I mean,
I got, okay, this is a purpose for now, to show them that they're separate, that they're holy, that they need to be different.
And there's talk later on in Leviticus that when it is willful sin, when it is presumptuous, these offerings, it doesn't work. It works on the ones that they do unknowing, but they have to go to the next level, not the sin offering, but the next level, what do they call it? It's the trespass offering. They have to go to the next level. And the trespass offerings always require an additional amount to be paid beyond the initial offering, right? Especially if there's someone else involved. If it's more than a sin against God, if it's a sin against a brother or somebody else, then there's got to be recompense for that part too. Which I was fascinated by that. Like, wow, some higher level of justice thinking, right?
I don't even know, and I need to read it again. There's so many different, there's the wave offering and the peace offering and the sin offering and all these different offerings that I don't even know the difference, I guess, between a lot of them.
Yeah.
I need to do a little more study on that.
Yes. And every time I go through it, I see new stuff. Every time I read through it, I'm like, I didn't see that before. But that's the whole point, right? I mean, it's put down on, it's given down to Moses and given to the people so that they could check back and go, what was that again? Oh yeah, I'm sure that's part of the deal. It keeps us all honest, right? I feel like there are times in later on in the Israelites' history where they clearly didn't know it, didn't study it. And we see big problems. I mean, we were talking about the Ark of the Covenant on the cart, and people trying to save it from falling off the cart, and right, they didn't know better. They didn't look into God's word, and so people died trying to get too close to God when they weren't doing something that He's telling them not to do. You know, this is not how I told you to approach me. And so the same thing's going to happen. You're going to be consumed by my holiness, is how they said it on the video. But it's just smitten.
Well, one of the things we're going to see is the Levites did not live up to their responsibility.
Neither did the Israelites.
Oh, neither did the Israelites.
That's right.
One of the reasons they didn't is because the Levites did not teach God's law to the people. That's why they didn't have any property, because God was their inheritance. They were the ones that were supposed to teach the people how to live according to God's law.
So if you remember Trevor's Sunday night lesson, he talked about generation, degeneration, and regeneration. And I feel like that's the whole point of Leviticus, is that we recognize the degeneration and we need a revival, we need a regeneration, right? That's the whole idea. We've separated from God, and we have to figure out a way. We don't have to figure out a way. He figures out, He tells us the way to regenerate, right? But we have to look into what He says and do it, right? So did the people at this time. I mean, that's what I see in Leviticus. Any other thoughts? Concerns about this study, or whatever? Critiques? Well, it's an exciting book, and I hope that you read it and read it and read it and read it and get stuff out of it, especially right now that in this holiday season where we're going to be studying it, because every time I look into it more, I'm like, something else hits me. I get something else.
Are you going to try and cover 7 chapters next week?
I'm not covering chapter to chapter at all in this study. Lessons in Leviticus is going to be more topical, or something that caught my eye, and I'm going to go deeper on it. And most of the time, we're not going to be solely in Leviticus. We're going to be all over the Bible.
But for next week, you wanted to make sure.
Well, it's pertinent to what I'm going to be talking about next week. Maybe even read it in the sense of, wonder what he's going to talk about. What is he going to pull from this?
The first 7 chapters.
Yeah, for next week, what I'm talking about is mentioned many times in the first 7 chapters. It's mentioned other places in Leviticus too, but many times in the first 7 chapters. And it's a concept that I want to spread out further from Leviticus, in the sense that how does it apply to us, right? We're not Israelites. We're not at Mount Sinai watching Moses get spoke to from the tabernacle and wondering what's going to happen now. We're Christians. We follow Christ, who obviously this was merely a shadow, and Christ is the substance. This whole book is the shadow of the substance of Jesus, if you think about it. And we serve Him. So what can we get from this that helps us with our relationship with Him? And ultimately God. Well, He is God, so. Does that make sense? That's the idea. So read the first 7 chapters for next week, and be prepared to, I'm hoping to get some more participation than we usually get. Who talked about that recently? It was Joe. Joe said that he watched the guy pretty much just get up there and start the class, and then they took it over, and he just, man, no. I'm not trying to be lazy, but if you saw my pun of the day today, that's kind of how I was feeling about this. It said, I used to be a procrastinator, but now I've turned pro. Yeah, so I hope we can, these Wednesday nights through to 2023, we can glean some stuff together, learn some stuff, and see a little bit more about what God's telling us in this book specifically, and how it kind of touches on other parts of the Bible and our lives. Which is not an easy thing to do, because you get back to all the blood and the gore, and you go, oh, right? I mean, so it's one reason I think a lot of people struggle in our day, and in America today, people struggle with this book when they're studying it, because it's hard to relate to the Israelites, 3,000 years ago or more.
Well, that's because the God that we worship today is a God of love.
It's the same God.
You think so?
Hello. I know, but that's what he's saying. We think, in our culture, they talk about it, how, that's the old punishing God that makes you do all these things to, I don't see that in this book.
Name's still Jehovah.
Yeah, I don't see that in this book. It's clearly given us a way back. He wants to be in the Israelites' presence. He wants them to be in his presence. He's trying to figure out how to do that safely. And where people don't come in and die every time they come in to see him, Anyway, thanks for tonight, and I look forward to studying it further with you guys, and we'll go from there, right? You betcha.